Hello, 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 and welcome to the last live stream session of today's Virtual Pass Summit. We are talking about Power BI governance today. And as part of Past Virtual Summit, they offer a whole bunch of more resources as well. So if you haven't had a chance to check them out, please do. They do all kinds of stuff for the community. There are also some session evaluations available to you in the portal. I know all of us appreciate the feedback, so please take the time, and they are also offering some prizes, so I hear. I'm going to spend the next 75 minutes with you, and my name's Melissa Coates. I'm talking to you from North Carolina in the US, and I'm the owner of Coates Data Strategies, and really I specialize in Power BI deployment, governance, and that sort of thing, more so than the development side of things. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this today because it's where I spend most of my time. What we're going to be doing is super fast overview just to do a quick level setting, and then we're basically going to iterate through about 10 what I call tips, and each section is going to finish with some suggestions of things you can do right now, and we should have a little bit of time towards the end for Q&A as well. During this session, we're going to also be using a tool called Poll Everywhere. So what I'd like for you to do is open up a web browser for me, if you would, and go to this URL. It's called pollev.com/mcoates224. And because there is a 30 to 90 second delay between when I am speaking to you and when you hear it, what we're going to do throughout the session is I'm going to ask you a question, then we're going to come back and see the results. So let's give that a try. The first question that I have for you is, where are you attending this session from? I'm in the US on the East Coast in North Carolina. So let me know where you're attending from. Just to clarify what we're doing from a platform perspective today, because I asked you to use a separate tool. In the regular Summit platform today, there's a questions panel, and Angela Henry has joined us today to moderate for us. So you're going to hear her pipe up and ask me some questions when we stop. Feel free to upvote questions that you are interested in, and we're going to check those throughout the course of the session. There's also a discussion panel. Use that to chat amongst yourselves, but Angela is not closely monitoring that one, really just the questions. And then the poll everywhere, that's the questions I have for you, as opposed to the questions you have for me. Somewhere in the course of this session, we are going to run into a QR code, and that's part of the Pass to Prizes that they're doing, and they're giving away a variety of things. If you don't already have the conference app and you want to participate, here is the URL, the red one kind of in the right on the middle there, where you can go and find the app to download. It's iOS or Android. And then there's also the URL if you want to understand kind of what's going on here with the program. But essentially, they're going to ask you some questions, and there's a leaderboard, and you try to win prizes. I'm assuming that you have Power BI currently, you've experienced some successes, you know about how to deploy content, but you know that there's some areas of improvement. So that's kind of my basic premise as far as this goes, because we're not talking about any basics or fundamentals or anything like that. Let's check those poll results and see what we got. We got Ohio, Quebec, Germany, Denmark. Your home office, very nice, very nice. Alberto, nice, okay. So let's do a whirlwind governance overview. Now, this image is from a Power BI migration info published on Docs, and I use it because it's good for this purpose, and most of the content that we published as part of this migration info applies no matter whether you are formally migrating or not. But during setup and evaluation, there is always some high-level governance that would happen. And as we begin to create new solutions, we find governance considerations. Same thing when we migrate from another system to Power BI. So although governance is always depicted at the end in diagrams like this, it should be happening all along. It's iterative and it never ends. The most successful companies will allow for a balance of new work to progressively happen while you're improving on your techniques for successful execution. What do we mean by data governance? Now, you might have attended a session just before this on data governance for beginners. So if you did, I haven't heard that one yet and what Kevin talked to you about. But governance is one of those terms that means different things to different people. And a lot of things might come to mind when I say data governance, because there are all these different things that we have tentacles into them and that are interrelated. So specifically, of course, in this section, we are talking about downstream BI and analytical usage of the data. But depending on your role, your hat that you're wearing that is governance, it's going to have tentacles into some of these other areas for sure. It'll just depend very much on your company and your role as well. In terms of a definition, there's actually two definitions that I really like a lot. So I want to present both of them to you. One of them is more formal sounding. This idea of we have clear-cut policies, procedures, standards, roles, responsibilities, accountabilities. Here's the part that I really like, that the data is well managed as an enterprise resource. So there's one that sounds very, governance-like. Here's another one that kind of starts the same. We've got decision rights and accountabilities. But the part that I really like about this one is who can take what actions with what information, when, under what circumstances, using what methods. And although that's all very vague, I like that because that gives us a way to frame, what it is that we're about to do. So here's the next question that I have for you. Is governance essentially a dirty word in your company? And does that affect how you approach anything? The way I tend to present it is that there's these 4 pillars of data is governed when it's trustworthy, it's secured, it's managed and audited, and it's documented and understood. And these kinds of pillars, especially if you don't like to use the word governance in your company or in your implementation, they're sometimes also referred to data utility. So that's an option for you as well. Trustworthy data, as you would expect, it's accurate. We have data quality, it's understandable, it's timely, it's traceable by lineage, right? And my favorite, not duplicated unnecessarily, and so forth. So lots of criteria there. Secured data, as you would expect, is only accessible to certain people based on their job role. And we're protecting it for privacy. And we're going to talk more about this. We're going to classify it based on sensitivity levels and give it data handling rules for what you can and can't do. And we can audit those actions as well. Managed and audited means I have assigned who owns this data or who's the subject matter expert, who is accountable for this particular content. And we have relevant policies based on how valuable is this content and what is that sensitivity level, because all data isn't the same and shouldn't be managed the same. And that we've got this awareness that it's managed throughout its entire life cycle, even through when we retire it or purge it and we audit it. That's very important. Finally, documented and understood. We've got something akin to a data catalog or documentation about our data sets and our reports to help the consumers and the users of that. And we're using an agreed upon taxonomy. So the same terms, the same definitions, that sort of thing. And that we are actually figuring out per data set, what's the value level, what's the critical data elements, and then how does that turn around and impact how we handle it. And users should absolutely care about data governance because they have all of these different kinds of questions. And essentially, my position is with a good plan for governance, we can save users from so many headaches. So that really means one of my core beliefs is that effective governance can absolutely improve user experience. If we're going to do it effectively, I think that has to be one of our core tenets. So let's see what the poll results said. Oh, good. Actually, the opposite, very positive. Yes and yes, no. Just isn't fully understood. Impacts the amount of effort to solve a task. That's fair. That's fair. All right. So let's get into the first one. The first tip, if you will, that I have is to deeply understand the centralized and decentralized BI approaches that are in use across your company. And what I mean by that is decentralized means the business is responsible for both the data and the report. So you have a very decentralized data ownership and management that is happening. On the far right, the exact opposite. Everything is very centralized in terms of who owns and produces and manages that content. And then you've got the middle, which is a lot of times what we view as the sweet spot, which is the data is centrally managed and the reports are being done by the folks in the business units. Understanding the needs here and what's really happening is going to inform a lot of your decisions that you make from a governance perspective. And the bottom line is all three are happening whether you know it or not. And if you're not sure, just have some conversations with people in the different business units, because you can't effectively govern Power BI if you don't have awareness and understanding of what people are really doing with it. So here's our next question. Of those three approaches that we just said, granted, I just said you all have them, all three, no matter what, but which one is most common and fits your most common scenario? The other consideration here is thinking about the scope of what's being deployed. So the scope being bigger, or organizational BI, or whatever you might call it, something that is deployed to a large number of people, it's going to have less flexibility and agility, turning into more governance and oversight and hurdles to get things published. And that's to be expected, right? Whereas as we move down to that bottom left, we have less oversight and more flexibility as long as we can recognize the differences in those pieces of content. So the final suggestions of this section that I want to give you are to assess your current state. It's absolutely okay to be tactical and get more strategic all the time, but make a plan for how we're going to continually improve. And in fact, depending on, what kind of thing you're needing to comply with from a actual regulatory perspective, continued improvement might actually be the goal, that kind of thing. So plan that this will take some time to mature. And determine, as we think about those three columns, right? Even though decentralized data ownership might give some of you the chills, it's reality in some places, and or at least for some types of data, right? So this implicitly means that some of your governance processes might need to be customized or flexible across groups. And what exactly will that look like in your company as that decentralized data management is occurring? And finally, handling co-ownership scenarios, having an actual plan for that. So for instance, one team manages the data and another team manages the reports. Or maybe multiple domain areas are collaborating on a consolidated data set. What exactly does that mean for how things are happening? So let's look at the poll results. Looks like we've got a lot of people in that center, a lot of centralization, and not a whole lot of straight out decentralization. So that's my general experience too. So that kind of fits with, if I were going to predict what I saw, that fits very well. So thanks, everybody. So let's move on to, and I'm going to stop for questions after the very next one, because this one goes a lot with what we just went through, is data trustworthiness. This is actually kind of my favorite topic. We just went through this list, but the one I really want to hone in on here is data is not duplicated unnecessarily. So one of the best ways that we can improve data trustworthiness is to reduce the number of data sets. And the reuse of data in Power BI is done through a couple of ways. The primary way, and we're going to talk about two of them, but the first way that I want to talk about is shared data sets, meaning we're going to serve up this data to many different reports. And formally, this is called a lot of times managed self-service BI. But IT does not have to manage the data for you to get a lot of value out of this proposition. Certain data might have to be tightly controlled and owned and managed by IT, and other data might be fully owned and managed by the business, in which case we can still think about this paradigm of shared data sets. I have a blog post and a video on this, which Angela's going to pop into the chat box over there for you, so that if you wanted to dive into this a little bit more, we could. But this whole concept, the formal name for it that they're using at Microsoft is called discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. And the other way I've heard this referred to over time is date your dashboard and marry your data model, which is kind of cute for us BI geeks. From a practical perspective, in Power BI, we would have a shared data set and various reports would connect to it by live connection. This does not have to be one massive single data set, but it should be relatively few data sets for sure. Now, I'm curious, have you experienced in your organization that, oh, some Power BI authors are creating a data set for every single PBIX file? And is that a problem at all that you have noticed? Now, we're going to layer in one more thing here, and that's a data flow. So in this depiction, we have a data flow with, say, some customer master data, for instance, which is going to serve up the data to multiple different data sets. And that's the other primary way with just Power BI core functionality that we achieve some data reusability. When you're measuring the success of your Power BI implementation, one of the key metrics that you want to look at is that data set to report ratio. So if you have a lot of one-to-one data set to reports across your organization, if you have 3,000 of them, that is a big warning sign. So let me pop over real quick to over here. I want to talk about a couple things really briefly. One thing that you can consider doing as you're separating out your data sets is literally use separate workspaces. So here I'm in a sales data workspace, and it's got several different data sets. So it's not one mammoth data set, but it is relatively few of them. And you might spot this and say, well, Melissa, you just said separate data sets into their own workspace. Why do I see reports? And so something that I tend to do, I haven't prettified this yet, so forgive me, but conceptually, what I like to do inside the report pages along with the data set is some relevant documentation and a change log kind of a thing that's just right along there with the data set artifact as well. So then if we go over to the sales analytics workspace, which is a reporting workspace, we actually don't have any data sets over here at all. And so that has several advantages to us, especially from a security perspective. And that URL that Angela provided will elaborate on that a little bit more. But the other thing that I want to point out is that they've made a lot of really great strides in the last few months on helping us understand what the lineage is if we are doing things like this, so that we say that, oh, this same report, my product analysis, comes from a sales data set, and this right here tells us it's in the sales data workspace. If I pop over there and look at it, I can see the impact analysis there if I need to. So we can see lineage from a couple different ways, right? If it's from the data set side, we're basically seeing the downstream impact analysis. And when we first started from the report side, we're kind of seeing just the upstream lineage. So that helps us a lot more if in fact we start implementing this sort of paradigm. So suggested wise that I will leave you with is when you have data that's useful for more than one analysis. I mean, sometimes it's a one and done, and the one-to-one in one PBIX is fine. But overall, look into doing this whenever you can, because it reduces inconsistencies, lessens compliance concerns, gives you less work to do things like, maintain your measures and maintain your row level security, et cetera. And decouple your data set creation and your report creation work. So in order to publish out to those two separate workspaces, I need two different PBIX files. So to facilitate that, we have to teach users to work in one PBIX here that's in live connection mode to the data set that's already published. And yes, it's a slight habit change. If we have to make a change to the data set, we republish that and we come back to the PBIX in order to refresh it and pick up that change. But we can set ourselves up for success with that by setting up, even how we store our Power BI files. So, here I've got a sales site that's just SharePoint, and it's our approved location where we're supposed to store our PBIXs. We're asking people to store them in this way. So those kinds of things can help facilitate the habit change that your authors will need to make. And then finally, certified and promoted endorsements are incredibly important for helping people know which data sets they should be using to create their own reports from. We're going to elaborate on that here in just a little bit. And guess what we have? We have run into the QR code for the Pass to Prizes game. So if you want to participate, take your mobile app now and grab a copy of that QR code. I'll give you just a moment to make sure you get it if you need it. All right, so let's take a look at the poll results. Concerning for reports that share common data. You share my concern, that's good. Let's see if this will let me scroll properly. Yes. I love how it makes some of them really big. It's very odd. Had to ramp up organization data literacy to avoid this. Yes. Interested in how to properly roll this out. Yes, yes, yes. Yep, I agree. That should be an excellent focus. Yep, I like how you're thinking there. All right, so let's talk a moment about guiding principles. And in the world of governance, we have a constant, oh, hang on, sorry, my bad. Angela, do we have any questions that have come in?
There are no questions. You're doing a great job of explaining everything.
All right, so from here on out, every time we look at the poll results, I will stop and check for any questions. So if you have any, definitely let her know. So let's talk about guiding principles for a second. There's a constant struggle in the world of governance between we want to enable our users, right? We're talking about a self-service BI platform here, even if we use it in a centralized manner, right? But enabling our users to get things done with the risk management and security side of the house. And so you've got this that is always a constant struggle, in addition to there's always conflicting priorities and conflicting opinions. You're never going to get around that. So what I want to do is give you something to think about, which is what is your focus? And this idea of splitting between an offensive and a defensive strategy. And this is going to change over time as your organizational goals might change, or even your data management level of maturity evolves and changes. But ideally, you're a good balance of both. So offensive, you're very much focused on things like revenue growth and cost reduction, and let's become data driven. Defensive strategy is very much focused on risk reduction and compliance and privacy and that sort of thing, which is obviously very important. They both are very important. The reason I'm mentioning all this is because, on the left side, an offensive strategy, which is easier for companies that are very customer focused, like maybe retail, they might have more tolerance for multiple versions of the truth. Things can maybe be a little more fast and loose. So a little bit of chaos might be accepted and even encouraged. A defensive strategy, we're not going to, stability is going to be much more valued, right? And a single version of the truth is much more likely to be highly valued. So, just kind of something to think about there, that you may have both happening. But if you're, say, a healthcare company, for instance, you're always going to lean more on the defensive side as a whole. So what's your current approach to implementing governance? So choice one is, you've got an existing Power BI implementation and you're adding governance on now. You need to reel some things in. And choice two is, we're planning first before we open up the gates and release it to the user population. And three is, you're kind of just iterating as well as you can as you go. We'll come back and look at that here in a minute. Guiding principles. So maybe your CTO likes to say everyone's a data steward, right? Something like that, that is, whether you have thought about it this way or not, but it's a pervasive cultural norm in your company. That can be a guiding principle. And then we can start saying things like, responsibility for governing data rests equally among all of our content owners and our subject matter experts, et cetera, right? This is a very data democratization kind of way of thinking. But knowing that this is something that's important to you, then you have basically your executives and your COE and whomever is involved with defining these has approved them. Now you have a focus that you can continue to march towards. Here's another one. We know that not all data has the same value. So we're going to define our critical data elements, and those are going to be managed a specific way, right? A greater degree of governance. So once we agree on this, and our executive sponsor and our key stakeholders, et cetera, they've approved it, we can then put a policy that we need, or processes or suggestions or best practices or whatever underneath it, and they can have teeth because we've started here. So figure out if you're playing offense or defense when it comes to governance decisions. In other words, to quote the guy from the book, figure out your why you're creating this particular policy. And get consensus on, if you're figuring out like where in the heck to start, right? Don't start with, oh, what should I do with these tenant settings, right? Back up off of that at the 10,000 foot view, and for your crafting policies, get consensus. So let's see what we said here. Okay, quite a bit of a balance there. So I've worked with customers in all three. Of course, the first one means, oh, you're reeling in things after the fact, and usually governance then is going to be an inconvenience, and but it might just need to be done because that's the position you're in. And of course, the first one, if you're holding out the user population from being able to get things done, that's kind of a challenging place to be as well. But depending on the kind of company you are, it might be warranted to a certain extent. So interesting. Thanks, everybody. All right, so the next one is about data policies, and short, clear data policies, the most important items. So we already have our guiding principle, and oh, my animation is messed up. Whoopsie. What we need is policy, and it doesn't necessarily have to be called a policy, right? But what needs to be done and why. And beneath that, we have processes, procedures that explain the how. And we might have standards for how we're going to measure this. And these things all need to be supported and audited. So let me give you an example. Maybe the organization has said, we want to improve our decision-making ability. So we have said we are going to identify and manage our critical data elements, a certain way. So a policy might be, all right, data sets that contain our critical data elements are required to have data definitions, sensitivity labels, and be certified. The process or procedure behind that might be, okay, we have a data certification process, and we have procedures about how we, set up the data definitions and where we manage them, who's handling it, et cetera. And a standard might be something like 100% of our certified data sets need to have an owner, and 85% of our certified data sets are re-reviewed twice a year. So that's how we can kind of take it from that, loosey-goosey high sky guiding principles down to, the practical nuts and bolts. Now, at a minimum, your data certification process, for it to be trustworthy, needs to have some teeth. We need to know the data sources. We need to do a tech review on the data model. We need to do a security review. We need to validate it's accurate. And we need to do a documentation review, because my position is if it's certified data, it should have some level of required content, right? So make sure that it is meaningful. Do you currently have a certification process in place? And if so, is it very specific? Say yes, but maybe you could do better, or no, not right now. We're kind of just leaving it up to the individual owners. We'll come back and look at that in a minute. Another common policy that you might start with is around data ownership. That's a really common one to hit early. And then we've got lots and lots of things to consider. Is the owner the same as the technical, let me rephrase, is the technical owner the same as the subject matter expert? Because those could be one or different people. And what if you have multiple subject matter experts? Is there a chain of custody from source to analytics? And what I mean by that is, if there's maybe a data steward that's responsible for accuracy in the data source, but then we've got somebody that's producing analytical data models down the line and doing calculations and all that kind of stuff, how does that affect your data ownership from source all the way down through analytics? And for certified content, how much leeway does your owner have? So let's say we went through the whole certification process last month. Now they need to just add a couple of things. What we don't want to do is have so much rigor that we're not letting people get things done and get things done quickly. So for instance, a customer that I'm working with right now, what we're doing is we are allowing the content owner to republish as they see fit, but twice a year, we're going to go through a recertification process and just make sure all is well. And so that way, that's a good, in our case, it's a good balance between letting them be agile, get things done quickly, right? But then making sure that, okay, we check all the boxes for oversight. And then you might also have a data handling policy, and I tend to correlate these directly with the sensitivity labels. So we start looking at different things per sensitivity label that we might actually implement. And we'll look at those here in just a little bit as well. So in terms of your final tips here is figure out what decisions you can align with that are already in place, and piggyback on them, reuse them. If you have data governance in place, right? What is self-service or Power BI governance? We might need to twist a knob a little bit for governing BI versus the source system a little bit, but what can we piggyback upon? And make sure that all of your policies and documentation, and I say the word policy, right? But I mean recommendations, I mean suggestions, I mean best practices, anything around here, and how you want to implement it, right? Policies are usually something that can be enforced and audited. So there's sort of these different levels, but you don't want to have so many data policies that everybody's ready to kill you because you're asking them to follow, so many different things. And in that case, they'll just ignore it. But just be consistent with whatever your existing organizational approach is. And pick the most important thing to start with, right? Data ownership, data handling, that kind of thing. See how that goes, and then build from there. So let's see what those poll results looked like. Oh, nobody's up in number one. Oh, you're hurting my heart. All right, let me do a quick time check here. All right. Accountability, expectations, roles and responsibilities. This is all really important, okay? So we saw these three modes earlier. And the thing is that how you approach your roles and responsibilities is going to be affected by what's happening here in your organization. So make sure that you go through and you find people in all of these different categories, and everyone understands, what's normal, what do they need to do, what can't they do, and where's there some wiggle room or some flexibility, because there will need to be some flexibility, especially if you have really industrious people that want to go above and beyond. And how can we help them do that in a responsible way? So I'm curious, who is ultimately responsible for Power BI in your organization from a role and responsibility perspective? This person or this department has ultimate authority for all of the decisions related to Power BI. So one of my core beliefs as well is that our content authors, so the people doing the Power BI work and publishing content, form the foundation of a well-governed system. So let's look at what I mean by that. Level one, these are the people that are doing actual data management and data stewardship and validation and publishing all of the content, right? Then on top of that, we have whatever you call it, right? A data governance team, a center of excellence. It could just be your BI team that takes on these roles. Or it could be multiple teams that have to work together, right? But this is the people that are going to do the work to work together with the level one people and figure out what the policies and the standards and such all need to be, and then support them to help get it done. Lastly, there's the auditing and the compliance folks, the ones that are unpopular. But can you think about how the more things are well managed at the base of this tree, the less concerns have to move up the tree. And then not pictured on this slide, right? But we have executive oversight over the whole thing. And that's important too. But this is really from a practical perspective of who's doing what. So get clarity on who your executive sponsor is, if you don't know already, and how much authority this person has to get things done across the organization, right? Because even though I said, let's customize policies and give people flexibility when we can, there's also going to be a lot of times where you're saying, hey, listen, this is how we want things done. And you need somebody with enough authority to facilitate that. And definitely define the roles and responsibilities. And whenever you can, actually make them formal as far as HR goes, because people will take them more seriously if they're really truly formalized. And then teach your people what their role is related to safeguarding data. And one way that you might do this inside of Azure Active Directory, a feature of the conditional access is called a terms of use policy. And so you can literally create a terms of use policy. And that would just be something like, the responsible use of data, right? You can set it up to where before this person is allowed to access the Power BI service, they have to read and acknowledge this. And, they got to do that once a year or something like that. It's very, very easy to implement. And that would not be the only thing you need to do. But from a technical perspective, that's a pretty easy thing to implement if you wanted to. All right, looks like we're mostly BI and IT. All right. Okay. So next tip, we want to talk about a data-centric audit and protection strategy. And it's called DCAP. DCAP is actually a Gartner term, and it just is taking all of cybersecurity and saying, let's think about the data part. But what needs to be protected, right? We know there's lots of companies that have had a lot of organic growth. So there can be a ton of artifacts everywhere. So in the first column, we have things that are stored in, say, OneDrive or SharePoint or whatever. Then we've got it published to the Power BI service. And then we've got it exported from the Power BI service that takes us back to column number 1, right? So we have a lot of content everywhere. That's not news to everyone. So fundamentally, what needs to be protected from a very wide lens, is identity, endpoints, infrastructure, apps, and our beloved data. So with regard to this idea of data-centric audit and protection, the whole idea is know where your sensitive data is, define how you want to protect it, and then govern it, audit it. In the world of Microsoft, this whole know, protect, govern strategy starts with let's define our sensitivity labels. And this is done in Microsoft 365. So it's beyond just Power BI, right? So you're gonna have to work with your IT folks because this is a organizational wide kind of setting. And here I've got an example of a handful of different levels that go through what the sensitivity level is for different kinds of data. Now, I'm curious if you are currently using sensitivity labels with Power BI. Now, when you go down this road, what I want you to do is think about what does that label really mean? So user access. For this particular label, internal, are external people allowed? Are there some certain conditions? From a data storage perspective, are we going to allow this to be downloaded? Can it be used on an unmanaged, non-organizational device? Things like data loss protection. Where's our sensitive info, and do we want to block access for certain people in certain conditions? And then this last one is not in the world of automation, right? But it's more in the world of user education. And that is this type of data, we would prefer that you handle it this way, right? More in the user education area of things. So if we have time at the end, I was going to do a demo of this. I'm going to keep moving just to make sure we don't run out of time for Q&A at the end. And if we don't have a lot of questions, I'm going to give you a little demo of what all that looks like. But I don't want to risk the last piece of things. So the step that you would want to take is establish a classification taxonomy. That is your list of sensitivity labels, right? Don't make it too complex. It should be just a few. They should be intuitive the way that they're phrased and can be localized, right, if they're translated to another language. They should be hierarchical because order matters and, generic and broadly applicable. And when you're creating a data handling policy, meaning if it says that the sensitivity label is restricted, what exactly does that mean cannot happen, as opposed to something that is maybe general internal use? So for instance, general internal use might be able to be downloaded, restricted, maybe not, that kind of thing. All right. Nobody has said absolute yes using sensitivity labels yet. Okay. All right. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say that we don't have end-to-end support for sensitivity labels with Power BI content yet the way we do with Office files. So I still encourage you, though, to start planning for it because it is a very important piece, even though the features and functionality are still evolving. All right, system administration. People read things. Oh gosh, I did it again. Sorry, Angela. Do we have any questions? That's because I'm like 7 minutes behind, so I keep.
No, that's okay. Well, we do have a question that came in pretty late after part of your first session or first section that you were working on.
Yeah.
And it is, do you have any suggestions on how to curb or stop users from sharing, in quotes, reports instead of using app workspaces or workspace apps for distribution?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. So yeah, I preach all the time that my choices are: first, use an app if you can, because it's the nicest user experience. Second, use a workspace if you can, if regardless of if we're talking viewer, contributor, member, or admin, if someone's allowed to see everything in the workspace, do that, because the security is managed at the workspace level. Third choice, not the first choice, is sharing. Because I think of sharing as it kind of overrides workspace security. It's kind of an exception. So you can share that one report with somebody, but it's object by object. So it's great flexibility. It has its place, right? But it's overused so very much. So I love the question. I think it's very much about user education and teaching people, hey, here's the right way. So I would go so far as, when we're going to talk later about activity log data, but I would go so far as to see in the activity log, somebody is overusing sharing. So, okay, let's contact them. Let's be a little, creepy big brother. Let's contact them and offer some information about, do you know about workspace apps and when those are the most appropriate? So I would be very, very proactive about that sort of user education, because you're right, it's important.
All right, and I have one more that has come in
Okay.
from Daniel. Do you have or do you use any special tools or software for maintaining all the governance info for referencing and auditing?
Yeah. So the the suggestion that I have is to incorporate on the menu here with the URLs, and that's set in the tenant settings. But under this learn, what you can do is you can hook it up with whatever you want to use. So I find SharePoint so darn easy to use for things like this. So, we've got an area for Power BI resources. I've got links. I've got, hey, here's when, your office hours and training classes are coming up, and a feed to the Power BI blog that's right there. Things like that. And then in addition to that, or instead of, depending on how your people work, is a team site. So I like to have a Power BI announcements kind of a channel. So, hey, that big, most important can't speak, sales shared data set, spit it out, right? It's going to be updated today, things like that. Or office hours is so popular, we're moving to 2 times a week, right? But that's separate from chit chat. And whatever you want to call it, a forum where people, if they feel comfortable, posting questions between themselves. But SharePoint and Teams are kind of the two biggies from a which technology would we use? But use what you have. If it's just Word documents, put into SharePoint. If it's well organized enough and able to be found by people, just use what you got. And then, if more appropriate technology comes along at some point, great. All right, so system administration. Here's the thing, is that people, and by people, I mean, people working in Power BI trying to get things done, they read things online about what they can do, only to figure out they're not able to make it work. They run into, some different problems. And some people in your organization are going to know who to contact and ask why, and others are just going to sigh and move on and say, okay, whatever, I'm just going to keep exporting to Excel from SAP, or whatever, right? So what we really need to be aware of is that the administrator has the ability to affect user experience a lot. Tenant settings is the really big one, but they also have, all these other things impact how easy of an experience people have. And I'm not saying everything should always be easy and wide open. I don't mean that. But for instance, what we don't want is your Power BI administrator to see, oh, export to Excel. Yeah, let me disable that. That's a bad idea because that also turns off Analyze in Excel and live connections and downloading, right? We don't want that sort of thing to be happening. So I'm curious, who's permitted to be a Power BI administrator in your company? Because my position is, we want it to be a very small number of people. So what I'd like for you to do is review each and every tenant setting to ensure that it's purposeful. It's not just because the administrator thought, oh, I should probably turn this off. They might be spot on, but we want it to make sure that it aligns with the purposeful policies. And then I want you to document them. And just a Word document's fine because we don't have a way to go in and through an API, for instance, and grab what the current tenant settings are. So document them, put it in your internal community hub. People will see that, oh, okay, this is enabled and it's enabled for these two groups. How I would request access is this, if appropriate, that kind of thing. And then people aren't going to be frustrated to say, oh, this push apps to end users, I can't make it work. I don't know why. Things like that you can absolutely avoid. And review who's a Power BI administrator. Reduce it if you can. And that's because they can have a lot of effect on things. And also in the workspaces in the service, administrators can go in and adjust access for any V2 new workspace experience, meaning they can provide access to themselves or anyone else. That's a very high privilege role. So I talk about this a little bit and using PIM, privileged access management, a little bit in a blog and a video that I published recently. So Angela, if you will toss that URL into the chat for me, that would be wonderful. And okay, nobody answered a mix of people in various departments. So that's good. That's the answer I like to see because that's where risk definitely comes up. But that URL she's going to give you, privileged access management, or I screwed that up, PIM, is very suitable for people that might legitimately need access once in a while. They just don't need to always be an administrator full time. So you can audit it, you can log it, you can have somebody approve it. It's very cool if you did need to have flexibility and sometimes give it to people in various departments if they need it in a pinch, for instance. All right, any questions about that, Angela?
No, you're doing a great job again. No questions right now.
Okay. So here, one of my favorite topics is to analyze and act on data that we have for things around adoption, auditing, and training. And so this idea of activity data or getting data from our activity log is absolutely critical. So we want to find our critical content, right? What's most frequently used, and if it's highly used and data refresh is failing, something's a problem, and are we supporting that appropriately? And change tracking, I want to know what content changes how often, and maybe even more importantly, when security changes and how often and by whom. And from an auditing perspective, this activity data is absolutely invaluable. Adoption efforts, right? So not just usage, right? Because adoption is far more than just usage, but how are we using the system, and is it the way that we really intend? Because more usage isn't always positive. We see a lot of new data sets being published. Is that a good thing? Not necessarily. If we see a lot of exports, is that a good thing? Not necessarily. How about trustworthiness? Certified versus non-certified data sets, right? That ratio we spoke of earlier. And license usage. Should we take a look at who's doing what, and are they effectively using the pro license that we gave them? Or do we have trial users maybe that are coming up on and are going to have kind of a service interruption soon? Though granted, that comes from Microsoft Grass, not the activity log, but we can see that a trial was started from the activity log. And really understanding the usage patterns, right? export subscriptions, etc., right? If we see that there's a user that absolutely never does dynamic rendering, they're always doing subscriptions. Well, what does that mean? Training opportunities. So we talked about an example of that earlier, right? Seeing people do a lot of sharing, or seeing that we could even be something along the lines of a newly licensed user. We saw that they published content for the first time. So we sent them a nice little message to say, hey, you know about our internal documentation, right? We could go take that really far. And suspicious usage patterns, right? So things that we don't like seeing. So a typical Power BI auditing solution would be more than just the audit log data, right? It would have data from a variety of different sources, consolidate it all, make sense of it, right? The same kind of thing we do in Power BI all the time, and really create some robust reporting. So have you set up auditing and monitoring of that nature for your environment? If you haven't already started, start grabbing that Power BI activity log data. And then over time, you can start augmenting it with some data from the other APIs, but just start at least at the very minimum, gathering the activity log data and storing the original raw data if you haven't been already. And then really use it. You can use it for just auditing and compliance and that kind of stuff, but you can also really use it effectively to understand how people are really using the system, and then you can tailor your adoption efforts accordingly. All right, lots of people, not yet for the auditing and monitoring. So, I like the extensively, love it. All right, so governance, we wouldn't have a good governance conversation if we didn't talk about our internal community. So it's all about helping people learn more all the time, right? We want to grow knowledge all the time. And we do so through all these items here that we produce as part of our internal community. And one of those best ways to reduce our risk is to increase knowledge. So even the question earlier about, hey, too much sharing, right? How much effort can we put into at least teaching people there's a better way? So do you have an internal community site currently? And what platform do you use for it? And what's the most important information that people go and get from your community site? So the things that I think it should contain are things like, how to get help with your issues, because people that are either kind of on their own in a department or less experienced are more likely to rely on formal support channels than they are for, leaning on their coworkers. And things like office hours and best practices reviews are very, very well received. So literally just sit down at office hours, help somebody work through a problem, and kind of do a co-development kind of activity. Training. So helping people understand how to use the system effectively. And this training does not have to all be developed in-house. A curated set of links goes a really long way in helping people wade through the crazy amount of stuff that's available online. Knowledge sharing. So this is all about things that you might formally do, like an announcements channel that maybe your center of excellence maintains, but it can also be peer-based, right? So lunch and learns and lessons learned. Sometimes people can learn an awful lot from somebody just like them that figured out something and is willing to share it. Resources, there's lots and lots of very important resources, things like templates are very, very important. How about sample reports that use best practices? So somebody says, I kind of don't know where to start. Well, here's a sample that we use here in our organization, that kind of thing. And documentation. So not only things like tenant settings that we talked about and things like data policies that we talked about, but those frequently asked questions and recommendations and that kind of thing. So you might have things that are formal and things that are more or less formal. So set up an internal hub of some sort, like the one I popped up and showed you a couple of minutes ago. Whatever is most convenient and kind of fits where people work will work just fine. And update the tenant settings so that the help menus, or it's called Learn, and whatever the other one is now, right? So that it goes directly to your pages. So let's see here. Live sessions. Okay, that's nice. Team sites. SharePoint information covers. The large font still kills me sometimes. Teams and Confluence. Yeah, Confluence is a nice tool. No, but I think we need one. Yeah. So the big thing here is that somebody has to nurture it and care about it. It needs care and feeding. And so you really have to have somebody take responsibility for it, or it'll just fizzle out and die. All right, any questions that we want to hit before we hit the last of our tips?
No, we got no questions. You're doing a great job.
Now we're back to being right on time.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to talk about data culture for a second. And so data culture, I have to mention Matthew, right? And the way that he defines data culture is that it promotes and encourages data-driven decisions by more stakeholders in more parts of the organization. And that's a cool definition. If you're not familiar with his data culture series, his blog is at SSBI Polar, and he's got, I don't know how many, couple dozen maybe. It's 4 or 5 hours worth, and they're all very, very good. So when we're talking about data culture, we end up saying, well, do we need a center of excellence? And I would say, first of all, you don't have to call it a center of excellence, right? You need a group of people that are experts in the organization and who are willing to support others. And so the scope of what a COE might do varies crazy wild between company to company. But it pretty much always includes these 4 items: nurturing that internal Power BI community, mentoring other people, your Power BI champions and your experts in the organization, helping manage the governance model, and having this cross-departmental view into what's happening in the organization. And depending on the kind of COE that you're building, you might also include things like direct user support. It might be level 1 and it might be level 2 or 3. So there's something like that. There's system administration that may or may not fall within the COE. And then it may or may not actually do hands-on development. So those are the things that kind of tend to vary a little bit more. Do you have a center of excellence in place? And if so, is it centralized? Is it federated, which would be kind of a combination of your shared centralized team with some satellite members, or completely decentralized? So here's the bottom line. If you don't have somebody that is specifically supporting, funding that data culture, it's only going to last as long as it's that person's pet project. So make sure it's more than just a pet project, right? And this is, tied directly in with that whole last section about the internal community, that it needs care and feeding. So decide who is going to nurture this internal community, and just make sure they have the time, the resources, funding, and motivation. They got to want to do it. And create your policies and guidelines. This isn't a surprise now because you've heard me, right? We want to empower your Power BI community. We don't want to just dictate, this is the way it's going to be, this is the new policy. Hopefully they help create the policies at the same time that they're all being developed. So really try to promote that sort of environment that is a balance between control and empowerment. I know it's hard, it's easy to say, and it's hard to do. And then define some very specific measurable goals for your community. to monitor progress, and that'll help you retain support in case it's ever in jeopardy. But that's really important too. And publish those reports with those KPIs on them for everybody to see for sure. So let's see, what do we got? Oh, all right. So I am most familiar with the first two. So I'm actually a little bit surprised that, you know, as many of you answered the decentralized as you did. So, okay. So as we wrap up, these are the tips that we went through. I'm going to come back to this in a second as we go through questions. The message really is, hey, iteratively make progress as you're building out governance and you're handling pressing things, right? You're getting things done, you're delivering value, et cetera, right? Because they're both important and we can't pause one for the other. Here, there's some various links that you might find helpful. There's some links for how to contact me. But now we have about 10 minutes left to do questions. So what do you got, Angela?
If I could figure out how to click the mouse for the unmute button. I don't have any questions, but I do have a comment so far from Daniel. He says it's a great session and you did a great job of answering all the questions, and is constantly referencing your enterprise deployment white paper.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Well, tell you what, I did skip a couple of demos as I went along. So let me kind of backtrack a little bit and show you something that that I wanted to show you earlier, and I just didn't want to jeopardize our last few minutes for questions just in case. But inside of, let me go back and kind of start at the beginning. Inside of Azure Active Directory, under security, under conditional access, there is, let me figure out which thing I want to show you. Actually, I want to show you this instead. So what I can do, this very first one is enable, and it says MCAS Conditional Access App Control. So MCAS is Microsoft Cloud Application, or Cloud App Security. And what I have set up is I've said for one application, the Power BI service, over here under session, so right here, and over here, what I have done is I have said is conditional access app control. And what this buys us is a couple of things. One is if I just launch a new browser as a user, one thing that it does is it starts displaying this message to say, hey, access is monitored, and we can see right down here, Cloud App Security, okay? When I go in, the other very interesting thing is, check this out. I have a suffix on the URL. It's just kind of interesting. But in Cloud App Security, if I go down to Discover and I go to my Cloud App Catalog, whoops, no, that's not the one, sorry. Investigate Connected Apps, sorry. And under, so where I'm at is here, and here. I have connected up Power BI in Azure Active Directory conditional access and set up Power BI here. So that actually buys us a few things that are very cool, right? So we can start seeing various things like where our users are. Here's all of the compliance info, which is really interesting because we can get this for lots of apps in Cloud App Security. We can see the people that are using the application, activity log. So now what I've got is I've got activity that is generated by Cloud App Security in here and the regular activity log. So I see normal stuff like, oh, export artifact or whatever. But check out this one. Download file, customer analysis, PowerPoint. This was actually blocked. And how it got blocked was this. If I go to my policies, and let me just do a little search for Power. I have set up a policy for highly restricted data block downloads. And earlier when I was talking about the sensitivity labels and I was saying, hey, you can define a data handling policy and things like, is a download allowed for this type of data? So there are certain things that you can automate with regard to that. And this is one of them. So here I've got a classification level of highly restricted. And I am saying in my demo tenant anyways, that cannot be downloaded. And it gets blocked, the user gets a message, et cetera, et cetera. There's some other things that we can do, like I've got one set up to say, if the application is Power BI and administrative activity is true, send me an email. And all that is somebody updated a tenant setting. It's gonna send me a message. So we can do a number of different things when we hook that up. So even though we don't have the end-to-end support for sensitivity labels with a PBIX file, there's like we do for, say, an Office document. I mean, there's some other things that we can definitely do that mean that it's worth you setting those up. Any other questions we got, Angela?
Yep, we've got one that just came in. So what tier of Azure Active Directory is needed to utilize this feature?
That's a good question. So there's like a Azure AD P1 and a P2. I do not remember if it's a P1 or a P2 item, but you're right. You definitely need different licensing than just Power BI, and you're going to need different permissions as well. So if the only permission that you have watching this is Power BI Administrator, the thing that I just showed you is definitely beyond that for sure. So sorry, I forget offhand. And there's all these different, there's like 4 or 5 different ways that you can, depending on what you have, that you can get these types of features. So yeah, but they have it all documented online for sure.
Great. And that's the only question that was out there for right now.
Okay, then let me just show you one more thing then while we're here. Let's see, let me go to my sales analytics workspace. And this one is about endorsements. So I want you to notice that, we got endorsements for apps and reports just, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, very, very recently. So super exciting. This report is set to be promoted, okay? And I've got a whole bunch of different things included in the app that do not have endorsements, okay? So what I want you to notice is that we have a combination of promoted and certified and no endorsement content in an app. But the app itself, if I go to the app endorsement, the app as a whole is set to certify. And so the thing that I kind of want to mention as you go down the road of figuring out what your process is for certification, incidentally, here's the little thing that says the app is certified. The thing that I want to mention is that the certification level of the app as a whole and all of the content inside of it, so all, say, 8 reports, are now considered certified. And sometimes I need to refresh. This has not been behaving for me recently. There it goes. So we see at the top, this little certified symbol, right? This particular report is indeed certified at the individual level. If I go to a different report, that at the individual level, it's set to be promoted. That's the one that we had just looked at an individual level. But when you view it through the app, it adopts the certified endorsement. So I mention this because as you figure out your process for certifying content in an app as a whole, it needs to take into consideration that every item included in the app needs to be under the scope of that review process. And if people have access to both the app and the workspace, and there's a difference, right? Is that a purposeful difference that you're accounting for, or should you make sure from your process perspective that, hey, if it's in the app and we're going to certify the app, we're going to set all the individual items as well. All right, so any last questions that we want to hit?
There are no more questions.
All right, so well, thank you all for joining, and here's the final bit of information. There is also the session evaluation that we would like for you to complete as well. So thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your past virtual summit.